Hello, and welcome back to the Garden of Grace devotion. My name is Pastor Katie, and I am one of the pastors at Trinity Lutheran Church in Lilburn, Georgia. Today, in the Garden of Grace devotion, I want to share with you an experience that I had last week when my family and I were on vacation in Michigan. We usually go to a place called Frankfort, Michigan. And one of the things that we like to do when we are there is we like to look for Petoskey Stones. This is a tradition that goes back many years in my family, and it's also a popular pastime among tourists and residents of the area. I think in part, people like to look for Petoskey Stones because they can be a little bit challenging to find. They're unique stones. They're made from fossils, coral. They're made from coral that has fossilized over time. And they can be found on the shores of Lake Michigan. The trick, though, with finding Petoskey stones is that it's much easier to find them when they are wet. When they are dry, they look sort of like a regular gray rock. Can't see much different about them. However, when you get them wet, you can then see the hexagonal pattern that identifies them as Petoskey stones. The water brings out the pattern in the stone, and you can see how unique it is. Now, there is no shortage, especially in a Lutheran church, for illustrations related to Petoskey stones and how the water brings out the beauty in them and all the things. But today I want to talk about my experience of finding them this year and something that I learned through that experience. So for some reason, this year, during my trip to Michigan, I found a ridiculous amount of Petoskey stones, especially during the first few days that we were there. I just kept going down to the shore, trusting that the stones were there, looking for them, taking my time, and there they were. Stone after stone. I just kept finding them. I knew they were there. I knew it was just a matter of me slowing down to look and find them. And I did. I found 57 of them, which is quite a lot. So many that I was taken aback by how many I found and how easy it was. I just kept finding them. I trusted that they were there, and I kept slowing down to look and found them. One afternoon, I was down on the beach with our daughters, and we were looking for stones, for Petoskeys and other stones, when another woman and a young girl happened upon us. They too were looking for Petoskey stones. Yet they were having a difficult time. One of my girls spoke up and announced that I had found quite a few. So the woman and her daughter started asking me questions. All of a sudden, I was like this Petoskey hunter expert. So they started asking me questions. How did I find them? What is my strategy? They talked about how difficult they are to find, how there was probably a shortage of them. They talked about their theory that perhaps somebody else had already picked most of them up. At which point, I admit, I felt a little bit guilty. Maybe there was a shortage. I started to question myself. However, I recalled what my aunt said and what I'd read, that new Petoskeys show up every day, just like God's mercies. So I reassured the woman that new Petoskeys come every day, and then I showed her how I look for them. I go to the water's edge and I pay particular attention to places where there are lots of stones clustered together. Then I stop and I look. I bend over and look. I stand in one place and I trust that there is a Petoskey there, that it's just a matter of me being patient and taking the time to find it. And I usually do. As I was telling her this and showing her how I do it, I found one and I gave it to her. She was like surprised at how quickly I found it. She and the young girl who were with her got excited and continued their search. I found another one or two of them using the same technique. It was interesting though. It wasn't long before it became competitive. I heard the woman say, "I want to get in ahead of you because I think you're finding them all." So she did. She walked ahead of me on the beach and she found one. Her second Petoskey of the trip. And she gave it to me, which was very gracious, and she kept looking ahead of me on the beach. Within my own humanity and competitive nature, I noticed my desire to get in front of her so that I could find more Petoskeys. Suddenly, my understanding of these stones as an abundance of resource and my peaceful, serene looking for them shifted into a scarcity of resource competition for these lovely rocks, stones, fossils. The next day, when I went out, I started second guessing myself. I started seeing the whole thing differently. What if there were really not very many out there? Maybe they weren't there for me to find them. When I was operating under the idea that there were plenty of examples of these fossils for me to find, I trusted and I knew that I only needed to be patient to find them. And my eyes were open to see them all around. When I started second guessing, I had a much more difficult time finding them. There's a saying I was reminded of just this morning. The saying is, you have to believe it to see it. This is a twist on the old saying, you have to see it to believe it. When I believed that these stones were there, I was much more relaxed and took my time. And I was much more able to see them. When I thought they might not be there, it was much harder for me to find them. One day, as I was walking up the stairs to the cottage, reflecting on how things are easier to see if you believe that they're there, a short sentence of scripture came to mind. The sentence is from 1 Corinthians 13, and it reads, "Love never ends." This is something I seek to believe every day. If I really believe that God is love and that love never ends, then there must always be signs of God's love in the world. And if I believe that there are signs of God's love in the world, like the Petoskeys, I'm more able to see them. There are places that I can go where I know I'm more likely to see God's love in the world. Through the church preschool and before and after care, through watching neighbors help neighbors, through the community garden down the street, in Sunday school. There are lots of places where I know and trust that there are signs of God's love in the world. And when I believe that they're there, I'm more apt to find them. There are many places to look for the signs of God's love in the world, and each new day is full of opportunities to do this. If love never ends, and if there's no shortage of examples for us to find of God's love, then where are we seeing God's love in the world? Where do you see signs of God's love in the world? Thankfully, unlike the Petoskey Stone, these signs can be found anywhere. It may feel more difficult to find them in some places, but if God's love never ends, then that means that there are signs of God's love each and every day. We are also called not just to look for signs of God's love, but to offer signs of God's love. Every time we are patient or kind, generous or treat someone in a loving way, every time we are gracious, we add to the examples, the living examples of God's love in the world. Just like the Petoskeys, new signs of God's love show up in the world each and every day, around us, in us, and through us, as God is at work in the world. May we take the time to slow down a little bit, to trust that there are signs of God's love all around us, and to look for them. May God help us to see them. May God help us to be signs of God's love in the world. I will share with you that before we came home, we set most of the Petoskey Stones free. We went back and dropped them along the beach. But I brought a few home with me to remember. To remember as a symbol that there are all kinds of signs of the love that never ends all around us. Sometimes we just have to trust that it's there and take the time to look. God's peace to you today and always.